Okay, there we go. All righty. Well, start down here. So we, I think that we're all hopefully biblically literate enough here to know Israel's role in the Bible. We could do a whole discussion on that alone, but just just a little review here. We see, very quickly in the Torah, in the first five books in the Bible, where God forms a nation of Israel for his purposes. He decides to form a nation. I have no idea why he did it this way. I'm not smart enough to know. Maybe he knows something we don't know. But he chose to take a group of people that were not by any means, or by any means had it all together, right? They didn't. So he formed a group of people. And, he says here in Deuteronomy, he first called out Abraham, of course. This is after Abraham. He made that covenant relationship with Abraham. But you come into Deuteronomy and you have that passage here, that says, "For you are a people, holy people to the Lord our God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you. You are the fewest of all the peoples, but it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." So when God formed a covenant relationship with Abraham and then he decided to carve out a nation, it wasn't like there was something special about them, right? God took a group of people that were broken and fallen, and a lot of them had been in Egypt for a long time, obviously, being raised in certain, or being around certain beliefs that did not cohere with what God wanted them to believe. So, it's like we need to keep in mind this comment here by John Walton. He's a biblical scholar. He says here, God's election of Israel did not give them a privileged position among the nations so she might gloat. Rather, God chose Israel to serve him and reflect his character in ways to other nations they may proclaim his praise. Isaiah 43:21. In this sense, God's election of Israel parallels his election of individuals. He has called her into existence to serve him in the world. Thus, Israel's election does not mean God has rejected the other nations. Rather, election creates for Israel the task of representing God among the nations so salvation might come to them, right? As we know, when you read that covenant he made with Abraham in Genesis, he says through the seed of Abraham, the nations will be blessed, right? And we know that we read how Israel is called to spread the knowledge of God to the world through their witness and character. And of course, the Messiah comes into the world through the nation of Israel. And he says very early on in his ministry in Matthew, he says, he tells his disciples, only go preach to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In Matthew chapter 10, he says in Matthew 15, he says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Sounds very exclusivistic. But then when you come to the end of Matthew, after he's resurrected, then he tells his disciples to take the good news to all the nations, right? To spread the knowledge of God about the Messiah to the nations. And then Paul, of course, does that as well. All right. Karl Barth, who I don't agree with on a lot of things, he did have a good quote here in this book, in Church in Israel After Christendom, The Politics of Election. He said, without any doubt, the Jews are this very day the chosen people of God in the same sense as they have been so from the beginning, according to the Old and New Testaments. They have the promise of God. If we Christians from among the Gentiles have it too, it is only as those chosen with them as guests in their houses, new wood grafted onto their old tree. He's kind of giving a little tidbit out of Romans 11 about the olive tree illustration there. And, I do like the term election a lot better than chosen. I prefer that language, like elected. I think that makes more sense to me than the word chosen. So that's why I've used that couple slides here saying election without any kind of Calvinistic baggage, by the way. I'm not going to get into that. So just remember that today, Jewish people are dispersed. Obviously, they're all over the world. We know that they had many exiles. We know that they're not all living in the land. They're everywhere. Maybe 15 to 16 million worldwide, probably more than that by now. Obviously, as far as different branches, you have Orthodox, you have the Hasidic groups that live in New York and Israel, not many in Columbus, Ohio here. You have the conservative branch, you have the reform branch. That's a lot of my friends were raised in Reform Judaism, which is a very liberal branch of Judaism. And then you have some Reconstructionalism, which is similar to like an atheistic Judaism in a way. So most of the people I've met over the years, and maybe you encounter, probably would be raised in some of those branches, even if, especially a lot of reform. Reform's very popular, which doesn't really, which is almost similar to like humanistic Judaism, very similar. Not really much of a having to have a personal belief in God is not always that imperative in Reform Judaism. Okay, we know that when it comes to Jewish identity, Jewish people define their identity in different ways. You can't say it's just one thing with them. It could be, sometimes it's defined as like a 4,000-year-old tradition about what it means to be human. For some Orthodox Jews, of course, it's the belief that it's a covenant relationship between God and the Jewish people. For some people, as we see tonight, some Jewish people, it's simply about culture and community. There's no personal belief in God, and God is not necessary. Some Jewish people define it differently. And of course, one of the key identity markers is non-belief in Jesus. That's one of the key identity markers for all Jewish people, even if you don't believe in God, is that they don't believe in Jesus. Okay, so you can definitely be, it just depends on who you talk to. What Jewish person you're talking to, what their background is, and how they view their identity. Okay, what are they really concerned about? If you talk to I would say that these are just kind of a general overview. Many Jewish people are concerned about tikkun olam, which means repair of the world. They're very concerned about this world, doing good in this world, fixing this world, not so much obsessing on the next world or the afterlife. They believe they obviously have a strong social responsibility, and family life is very important, of course. They've been through a lot, so obviously they're trying to always keep their people together, keep them safe. So yes, they believe in doing good things. It's how you live is very important. Your actions, not as much focused on beliefs. They don't necessarily have like a systematic theology book that they follow. It's not like in synagogues you're raised with like a systematic theology book or an apologetics manual. Not as much focus on doctrine as much as Christianity has. Okay. Now we know that Paul obviously had a huge burden for his own people. We know that he says in Romans 9:1-5, he wishes he was cut off or cursed from the Messiah so that his brethren, his kinsmen, would come to faith, right? That's how burdened he is. He'd rather be separated from the Messiah in order for his own people to come to faith. He obviously has a lot of anxiety about it. He talks about how they still have the covenants, the temple service, the promises, all those things are in present tense that Paul talks about in Romans 9. He talks about them in the present. It's not like in the past. So he obviously was very concerned about the salvation of his people. And then we know that we kind of could lay it out here that, when you look at Romans 9-11, it talks about the gifts of Israel, the uniqueness of Israel, the calling of Israel, the confirmation of Israel's promises, and how Israel's election can't be revoked. He says at one point in Romans 11, the gifts and callings cannot be revoked, right? He doesn't. So that's very hard to say that God is done with Israel. Okay, if you read Romans 9-11. So, I don't have time to go over Romans 9-11 detail, but we can do that another time. When you look at Paul's missionary work, we know that he went to the synagogue first. We read that book of Acts. He continues to go to the synagogue. He even says in Acts 13:46, when he gets frustrated, obviously, he says, it's necessary that God's message be spoken to you Jews at Antioch first, but since you reject it, consider yourselves unworthy of eternal life. Now we turn to the Gentiles. But we see in the book of Acts, he's going to the synagogue at Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, Corinth, and Ephesus. He sees him. You see him returning to Ephesus in Acts 19. He has obviously a lot of discussions in front of Jewish people there. So the early mission obviously was to the Jew first, right? Before it started to spread geographically outside of Jerusalem. Okay. So I say all this because, we need to understand that the fact that there's so many secular Jewish people and that they don't seem to care about God's existence, or they just don't see any need to have a relationship with God is sad. And also it certainly breaks the heart of God, of course. So the apostles, certainly, if you read the way they spread the faith in the first century, they did a lot of apologetics. They defended and confirmed the gospel. Paul reasoned and explained, proving from the scriptures that the Messiah had to suffer and rise again from the dead in Acts 17. It says in Acts 18, every Sabbath, Paul reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks, right? Peter, of course, says in 1 Peter 3:15, about sanctifying the Lord in your hearts, always being ready to give a reason for the hope that is in you with gentleness and reverence or respect. So that's the way the faith spread in the first century. So let me go ahead and skip ahead here. Now, if you have any of these books by Michael Brown, I've had him on 2 Zoom calls, by the way. We've had him here. He has written over the years this 5-volume set, Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus. Those are really long and extensive books. There's a lot of material in there. I encourage you to have them, even if you don't even know any Jewish people. They're very interesting and very helpful to your own faith. And but the point is that he wrote these books in dealing with a lot of Orthodox Jewish people that are really practicing the faith, people that are more conservative or Orthodox. Not really, these books are not written for secular Jewish people. Jewish people don't believe in God. They're written for us to help deal with people that are more Orthodox. Now, for me personally, I do not deal with a ton of Orthodox Jewish people. I just don't. I deal mostly with secular Jewish people. Now, some people on this call may have more interactions with Orthodox. That's fine. If you're in Israel, maybe you're dealing with more Orthodox there. Of course, there are a lot of secular Jewish people in Israel as well. But the point is that I don't really deal with a ton of Orthodox. I have dealt with some over the years, some Jewish people that are more devout and little more conservative Orthodox, but overall, mostly I'm dealing with secular Jewish people. That's why this call is designed towards that end. But if you want to get more into Orthodox objections and those kinds of things, I would get these 5 volumes and put them on your shelf and read them. So we talk about secularism. Think of someone who's secular. They say, I'm secular. I don't really, I'm non-religious, they might say. I don't have any belief in anything. Sometimes, this has different definitions. We say sometimes say the United States is becoming more secular, or this country is becoming more secular. It can be defined differently. For example, it might mean someone who holds like an atheistic or materialistic worldview, that they believe in the religion should not influence the public square. They want religion out of public policy. They want it out of the public square. They don't mind if you practice it privately, but just don't bring it out into the schools. Don't bring it out in the universities. Don't bring it out into politics. Don't bring it in the marketplace. Just keep those things separate. They sometimes, of course, in many cases, they're concerned only about the here and now. They're not thinking about eternal things. They're not thinking about the afterlife. A lot of them believe, of course, humans can do everything. Humans are the ones that have to do everything. There's no God to help us, right? We do it as humans. We come up with the technology. We come up with the education. We're the ones that do it. We are the ones. So it just depends on who you're talking to. But I would say that, we think of secularism. I'd say that probably these 3 issues probably play a role in someone that has a secular outlook on reality. Okay. Maybe they don't even call it secularism. Maybe they call it secular humanism. Maybe they call it materialism. Maybe they just say, I don't believe in God. I'm just atheistic. It just depends. Okay. But just have to figure out what they mean. To get more specific, when it comes down to these 3 things, atheism is a philosophical religious position that has a disbelief in the existence of a God or any gods. They don't just reject the God of the Bible, they reject all gods or any non-material realm. Okay. They don't believe in souls, spirits, angels, demons, any of that stuff. Okay. They're mostly, they believe in materialism, which is the view that everything is a result of matter. All you are is matter in motion. You're just molecules in motion. Humans are just a big glob of matter. We emerged out of inorganic matter, and we just got here through chance and time. And sometimes there's another view called naturalism, which is a view that there is no supernatural realm, that everything's just natural. There's probably some overlap between materialism and naturalism. So sometimes secularism kind of falls into these things as well. Most of the universities, if you go to a secular university, will probably promote the worldview of materialism or naturalism. That's going to be undergirded in every major you take. That's generally the view. They're not going to teach you that God exists and he created the world there, right? So it's called a secular university. Okay. Now, there have been a lot of articles that talk about this, that, you don't need to believe in God to believe in Judaism, or you don't need to believe in God to be Jewish. There's no doubt that many Jewish people do not necessarily think that they need to believe in God to have a Jewish identity or to practice a Jewish lifestyle, meaning that they don't need to believe in God to raise their kids Jewish. They don't need to believe in God to say they're ethnically Jewish, because it's an ethnicity. If your mom's Jewish, you're Jewish. It's an ethnic issue or it's a cultural issue. But there's no doubt that many Jews don't see the need to necessarily believe in a personal God. Take, for example, these two lovely individuals, Ethan and Evan, two students at Ohio State where I do ministry at, two Jewish hardcore atheists. I've talked to them twice. They're twins, as you can see. They have a Zoom call called the Wildlife Brothers. They're really into zoology because they're zoology majors. I've talked to them. Let's see. I just talked to them this past April, and they like to quiz me on what I know about evolution all the time. But they're totally secular. They're ethnically Jewish, but they don't believe in God, and they're pretty dogmatic about it, about being atheistic in their views of God. And so it's just interesting that there are quite a few people like this. They're not the only ones, as I'll show you. Okay, they're just example of a couple of students at Ohio State where I do ministry. I had a long conversation with them last April. Anyway, I had talked to him before that too. According to Pew Research in 2020, that's only 2 years ago, it says about a quarter of U.S. Jewish adults, 27%, do not identify with the Jewish religion. They consider themselves to be Jewish ethnically, culturally, or by family background, have a Jewish parent or were raised Jewish. But they answer a question about their current religion by describing themselves as atheistic, agnostic, or nothing in particular rather than as Jewish. Among Jewish adults under 34 intend to describe themselves this way. That's about right. So I think it's good to know this, because I think that many Christians assume that, maybe we can just pop open 365 messianic prophecies with every Jewish person that's out there, and it's just automatically going to get them to believe in Jesus. But those days are long gone. I'm just going to say it. Yes, you can try to use prophecy today, but overall, you have to come to the starting point that if they don't believe the Bible's an authoritative, inspired book, it's no different than a Muslim trying to convert you to Islam, trying to use the Quran, right? Muslims try to convert me to Islam. They try to quote the Quran. I'm like, I don't care what the Quran says, because it's not an authority to me. So you trying to use the Quran to me is useless, right? I'm not under its authority. I don't think it's a revelation from God. Okay, so that's a whole topic for another time. So when it comes to like the broader culture, the people that are movers and shakers that impact others, I just want to mention some of the prolific Jewish atheists out there. Now, you may have never heard of these people and you may not care, but they're the ones that are out there in the public square. They're impacting others. I just want to show you how many prominent ones there are. This guy right here, Jonathan Haidt, I actually witnessed to his nephew at Ohio State. His nephew goes to Ohio State. I witnessed him one day. He said, "Do you know who my uncle is, Jonathan Haidt?" I said, "Yes, I have his book called The Righteous Mind." How ironic. I actually have both of these books, The Coddling the American Mind. He gets a lot of things right as far as where we're at as a culture when it comes to politics and religion. He's right about all this stuff, but he is a Jewish atheist, doesn't believe in God at all. But, he's definitely someone that's had an impact on the broader culture, on some of his views, his teachings, his books, his YouTube clips. So, but he, like I said, I agree with a lot of things he says. But he just, as far as his personal beliefs, there's no God in the mix for him. Okay, and that tends to happen with these kinds of people. Another guy is this guy, David Silverman. He used to be the president of American Atheists from 2010 to 2018. He was raised in a Reformed Jewish home, born in a middle-class Reformed Jewish family. Went to Hebrew school, had his bar mitzvah, just like all my friends. They all went to Hebrew school, or maybe went to Hebrew school, but they definitely have their bar mitzvahs because I went to them. But he was the president of American Atheists. He's a very staunch Jewish atheist. He debated a friend of mine online. But I mean, you can see it online. He debated him publicly, but it's online. But he is as atheistic as you'll find. So anyway, look, he's in president of the American Atheists. How exciting, right? Rebecca Goldstein is another one. She's married to a guy named Steven Pinker, who writes a lot of books. He's another atheist, by the way. I don't think he's Jewish, though, but she was raised Jewish. She was raised Orthodox. And became an atheist at the end of her undergraduate degree because she took a couple classes, and I guess it just killed her belief in God. If you don't know what you believe and don't have strong convictions, obviously it's not going to take much to sway you. But she's a well-known public intellectual. And anyway, she's another one. Lawrence Krauss is another one. He's an American physicist and cosmologist. He actually has had some controversy around him over the last 6 years where he taught at, I think it's Arizona State or University of Arizona, one of those schools. But he wrote a book called The Universe from Nothing, Why There's Something Rather Than Nothing. He's debated a lot of Christians, including William Lane Craig, who's a well-known Christian apologist. Very staunch atheist. But obviously Krauss is ethnically Jewish, but big science writer, big influence in the scientific atheistic community, but definitely does not believe there's a God, and just culturally Jewish, raised Jewish. This guy right here, I had him come to High Estate and debate a friend of mine, Larry Shapiro. There's the debate on the resurrection right there. He debated the resurrection. I was actually, of course I was there because we co-hosted it. But he wrote a book called The Miracle Myth, Why Belief in the Resurrection, the Supernatural is Not Justified. Teaches at the University of Wisconsin. So, just another person raised in the Jewish community, raised Jewish, but no belief in a personal God, definitely doesn't believe in the supernatural. And then we have, there's another one. I think he's missing here. Oh, I'll show you. There's another one coming in a minute. Sorry. When it comes to anybody, let alone Jewish people, I don't believe in God, you always have to get to the bottom line, like what's their truth language when you're talking to people. What language are they speaking? What are their starting points? And when it comes to truth language of Jewish people, there's no doubt that many of them are influenced by postmodernism and a post-truth culture. Okay. Now, you may say, what do I mean by postmodernism? Postmodernism is a movement that is all over the country, all through academia. All these views that gender is a social construct. People say gender is socially constructed, that race is socially constructed, or this is socially constructed, or language is socially constructed, that you determine your own truth. The truth is your perspective, that you can make your own reality. You decide what truth is. That's all postmodernism, post-truth. A lot of it's postmodernism, though. Okay, it's all throughout the humanities and universities. It's all throughout the whole debate of what is a woman. We can't define what a woman is. That goes back to postmodernism. Okay, it goes back to the deconstruction of language and all those issues. So it's not new. It's been around a long time, but definitely many Jewish people have been influenced by this. We seem to want truth in every day of our lives. We can't survive without knowing if we have true bank statements, if we want true prescriptions from our doctors, we want the teachers and professors to tell us the truth. We want our friends and family to tell us the truth. We try to have politicians tell us the truth, which is virtually impossible. We want true instructions on how to use something. We purchase it. The list goes on. You can't survive without truth all day long. And there's no doubt that people were incredibly interested in truth when it came to COVID. Oh boy. I mean, when it came to COVID, it's like, who has the truth? Am I getting factual information here, right? Oh, they have the truth. No, they don't have the truth. No, they're lying. No, they're not lying. Oh, the narrative just changed. Yes, last week. Oh, it's different this month. Oh, wait, this is what's true. Oh, that's not true. The list goes on about that issue. And it's no doubt that people seem to care a lot about truth because they're petrified of dying, of course. So at the end of the day, which I understand that, by the way, but the point is that, truth really came to the forefront again when it came to COVID. So when it comes to God's existence, as I said before, there is no doubt that, God's existence impacts everything. And it's a shame that many Jewish people don't see sometimes they see the importance of it or the urgency. That the God question impacts the way we view reality. It impacts how we define and attain knowledge. It impacts our morality and ethics. It's going to impact how we view where we came from, where we're going, how we explain what's wrong with people, why is there suffering, evil in the world. The list goes on. So God impacts everything. That question of whether God exists. And so I would say if we're dealing with just some tips on how to talk to some of these Jewish people that are secular. And by the way, you probably could use this for anybody who's kind of in this mindset where their truth language is more scientific and empirical, meaning that they see science as the only way to know things. They're kind of just viewing the world through the lens of science and things that could be tested with their five senses and all that stuff. There's another Jewish atheist named Alex Rosenberg who's written a book right here. There he is. He's another Jewish atheist. He teaches at Duke. By the way, a lot of Jewish atheists are in academia. Have you noticed that? That's because academia produces a lot of Jewish atheists. Okay. A lot of Jewish people go off to college and into grad school with just an ethnically cultural Jewish background, no strong convictions about God, no really maybe they do, but a lot of them don't. And then they get into the university setting, and then they just suddenly now they're just become like staunch atheists. It's not that the university's deliberately trying to produce atheists. It's just that they don't know what they believe, and then they start studying, and they're like, oh, well, this answers this, and this answers that. And I think I've got it all figured out, and now I'm just going to be secular, completely secular. So anyway, Rosenberg is a guy that definitely believes that science is the only way to know anything. Very what we call scientific reductionism. He reduces all reality down to one way of knowing. So he says there in his book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality, he says, is there a God? He says, no. What is the nature of reality? He says, what physics says it is. What is the purposes of the universe? He says, there is none. He says, what is the meaning of life? Nothing. Why am I here? Just dumb luck. Why should I be moral? Because he says that because it makes you feel better than being immoral. So here we have someone that definitely has a very atheistic view of reality or nihilistic. And it's sad, but anyways. And he writes books and people buy them, sadly, and believe them. The problem with that view is that his view of science is the only way of knowing things is that just remember that science is restricted to only look for material physical causes. Okay. Science is only set up to find physical things, physical explanations. Okay. It doesn't deal with the big questions that transcend the physical world. Okay. Like, why am I here? What's my purpose? How do I determine what's moral? Things, the big questions. It doesn't deal with what we call the big metaphysical questions. Okay. It doesn't really, it's just very restrictive and very narrow. Okay. So that's why you need other things to talk about God besides science. You need things like philosophy and theology, for one thing. Okay. Just for example, I'll give you an illustration. If you are out on a beach with a metal detector and you're trying to find metal in the sand, obviously, you do know before you start using that detector that it's only designed to find metallic objects, right? So just because it's only designed to find metallic objects, does that mean that there's no other kind of objects out there? Does that mean that there's no plastic on the beach or paper or rubber or anything? Of course not. You know there's other objects out there, but this particular detector is only designed to find metal. And the illustration is that science is only set up to find physical and material explanations, but it doesn't mean there's not other things out there in reality, right? It's only set up to detect physical and material things, okay? But it doesn't mean that there's no other non-material things out there. So it's very, very restrictive and kind of boring, to be honest. And by the way, you should watch that clip right there if you get a chance. What Science Can't Prove. Dr. William Lane Craig explains this to Peter Atkins, who's an atheist. It's really funny. But anyway, now there's been a really good book, as I mentioned before, that came out over the last year. And actually those two Jewish atheist kids that I spoke about earlier, I suggested this book to them when I first saw them a year ago. It was on my table when I was talking to them. They're really interested. But then they said, when I saw them back in April, they said that they had read it. By the way, these are the guys that were back here. Do you remember them, the two guys I mentioned right back here? They're these guys, Ethan and Evan. So these guys, right? Okay. So when I brought this book up to them back in April, I brought it back up and I said, have you read this book, The Return of the God Hypothesis? They said, yes, we read it. So then I started talking to them about certain chapters in the book, and it was very apparent to me that they hadn't read it because they were still bringing up a lot of the same objections and some of the same things that have been addressed in this book. But anyway, this is a great book. It talks about three of the most current scientific discoveries, such as the beginning of the universe, the design or fine-tuning of the universe, and the origin of biological information that's needed in DNA to build the first living cell. He goes over a lot of the objections to these arguments. He goes over the history of them. So it's a great book if you want to get that. So, when we are talking to Jewish atheists or people in general about God's existence, that's our question of the day sometimes on campus. Does God exist? You can see all the yeses, nos, and I don't knows. Most people, there are still a lot of yeses, as you can see. Yes, there's some no's and there's some don't knows, but you can see there's still a fair amount of yeses, which is a positive thing. But, of course, we're going to ask them, why do you say yes? Why do you think God exists? And, most of them, I'd say one of the top three ways they know God exists or they say God exists is because of creation. They'll say, I don't know how do we get here? How did all this stuff get here? Is it chance? They're like, there's no way. Like, there has to be some God, because there's no way we just popped into existence through random chance. And so they're kind of having a hard time believing that the universe was produced by like a mindless, undirected, non-conscious, non-moral process. They have a hard time believing the human beings were produced by an undirected, valueless process. They have a hard time believing that life emerged from non-living matter somehow over chance and time, and then that just luckily there happened to be the cosmic constants just happened to be okay, and we popped, and this universe just popped out just fortunately the universe popped out that allowed life to get going on Earth. So they have a hard time, they're not articulating it quite this way, but they really are basically saying the same thing. When they say, yes, there's a creator, it must be like because there's a creation, they must believe in some kind of creator. That's basically what they're saying. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean they believe in Jesus, so they believe that, they go deeper into history, but the point is that they all believe in these people believe in some kind of generic God, which, as isn't enough to give them saving faith, right? Because the demons believe that God exists, as James says. So just because someone believes in God or believes in a higher power, creator, is not going to be good enough. It's like step one, right? Then they have to go beyond that to deal with the person of the Messiah, right? Okay. Now, sometimes I deal with, when I deal with Jewish agnostics say that, they just don't know if a personal God exists. They can't know, or they don't know. How can I know, as I say to them? I get into this issue of how they can have knowledge of God. That's what that means. They don't think you can have knowledge of God. You don't know. They don't know how you can have knowledge of God, and they're not sure how to approach it. Okay. Well, one thing for sure is that God doesn't fit into this category. He's not like a table. He's not like a car or a house. He's not put together. He doesn't have parts. He's not physical. You can't measure him. He doesn't have limitations. He doesn't, he's not composed of anything. The category that God's in, God's an unmade thing. These things are all made by somebody else. That's why when someone says what caused God, it's a category mistake. They're putting God in the category of made things, composed things, physical things. Okay. So just remember that none of these things are directly visible to us. You don't see electrons directly. You don't see protons directly, neutrons, individual atoms, electric fields, magnetic fields, gravitational fields. You don't see justice directly. You don't see consciousness directly. You don't see the wind directly. But what you do see, you see the effects of these things. You see the effects of them in the world around you, okay? You make an inference that these things exist. For example, I don't when the branch outside my door is below, when it's moving back and forth, I don't see the wind directly, right? I see the effects of the wind, right? On the branch, right? It's moving that branch back and forth, but I don't see the wind directly. Just like these other things, I don't see them directly. I see the effects of them, okay? There's no justice molecule I can see directly. I see the effects of justice, okay? That's what we do when we think about the existence of God. We see you want to know how God exists, you look at the effects of God around you, okay? You look at his effects all around the world, and then you reason back to a cause for that effect, and that cause is God, okay? Paul talks about this in Romans 1, where he says that what can be plain about God is what can be known about God's plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, nearly his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. Notice he says that God is revealed through the things that have been made. So we look at the creation, we look at the design of things, we make an inference back to there must be a designer. We look at things created, we say there must be a creator. See, we see the effects of God, what he's made. Okay? And by the way, that's what Stephen Meyer is doing in this book, by the way, if you ever read it. That's exactly what he's doing. He's talking about the effects of God. We have a universe. A universe that came to existence at a beginning point. That means we need a cause for that. We see the design and fine-tune of the universe. What's the cause of that? Back to God. We see the effect of the origin of information, your DNA code. What's the cause of that? Goes back to God, okay? See? Even though we don't see God directly, we see his effects, okay? Now, one thing for sure is that many Jewish people, as you know, are, I just want to say politically, a lot of times more left-leaning. They're incredibly concerned about justice, equality, and rights. And so if their truth language is that the issue, if they're concerned about those things, you do have a good talking point with them because, as I said, they do believe in tikkun olam, which is the repair of the world. They believe the world needs to be fixed, like we need to bring change and pursue justice, equality, and rights for people, which of course we believe in as well. But the problem is that when you start trying to fight for those things without God as the foundation or starting point, it's really tricky, okay? Because, obviously, if you think the world needs to be better, needs to be different, then you must have some sort of standard you're trying to adhere to, some sort of standard of goodness, right? The question is where that comes from. You obviously must know the world needs to look a certain way, but by what standard or who gets to decide what a better world looks like, right? So without God in the mix, it's hard to understand what that is, okay? So if you want to work towards a better world, once again, who defines what better is? If you want to help people and work for equality, justice, and rights for humans, the question is, why do people matter anyway? If you're just a blind cosmic chance accident, right? So, as I said before, one of my favorite t-shirts that is going to be on me shortly, why does anyone matter at all? If God doesn't exist, nobody matters, okay? So like I told you about the girl that came up to me. I think I mentioned this. She was an atheist. She came up to me about 4 months ago, and what'd she say to me? She said, "Do you believe in Black Lives Matter?" And I said, "Oh, you're an atheist." She said, "Yes." I said, "Well, why does anyone matter?" She looked at me and said, "That's a good question," and that is a very good question. On an atheistic worldview, why does anyone matter at all? Who says anyone matters? Okay, what group says anyone matters? Why are humans so important? Okay. Do we have intrinsic value, dignity, and rights because we bear the image of a personal God? Or are you just an accident of nature and only a higher form of an animal? And the highest authority you have is science. Okay. If God's not in the mix, it's going to be very hard to ground value, dignity, and rights of humans. Okay. Now you can do that on a subjective level if you want to just, say, hey, you know what, this people group matters and this person matters, and then another person might say they don't matter. I mean, it's between you and it's your opinion versus their opinion, right? But of course, if God exists, all people matter and all people have dignity, value, and rights. Okay. For example, if you're going to adhere to Richard Dawkins' view, then it's going to be hard to have a high view of people. Okay. Look what he says here. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows or cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So, that's a very, that's not a very uplifting set of words there. Of course, he's one of the most staunch atheists in the world. He's written a lot of books on atheism in the last 20, 30 years. But that's very, that's if that's the case, if that's really true, which it isn't, then it's going to be hard to fight for humans based on if there's any kind of grounding point. I don't know where it is. Once again, also, if you're a secularist and you think that you're morally obligated to help the world to be a better place, and you're morally obligated to fight for equality, justice, and rights, why is that? Where do your moral obligations come from? People say that things are not fair, they're not right, that's not justice, or I want justice, that's morally wrong. They'll say that's not, what's wrong with people, that's evil. It's obviously they know there's some sort of standard that's being violated. They know there's a difference between what's fair and unfair. They know the difference between what is just and unjust. They know the difference between what is morally right, morally wrong. And they seem to know there's a difference between what is evil and good. So without God, what is the standard they're appealing to? If there's a standard that measures good or bad, where does it come from? Okay, is there an authority? And I would say without God, it's hard to establish any kind of standard. I don't know where you could say it comes from society. I don't know which society you're picking from. Societies are different. You could say it comes to the individual. Well, individuals have different views on what is good and bad. So it's just, you're going to fall into relativism if you don't have some kind of objective standard to appeal to, right? So if you're going to fall back to, I am the center of everything and there is no God, then obviously you can make your own moral values, moral duties. You can determine what people group has value, dignity, and rights. You can set your own standard for what the world should look like. And of course, you get to define what happiness is. My daughter just got back from a few weeks ago from doing some pro-life ministry in DC. And I asked her what her biggest takeaway point was. I said, what was the one big thing that God showed you took away from being in there during that week? It was right after Roe was reversed, by the way, the week after Roe got reversed. And she said, my big takeaway point is that people want to do what they want to do, and people don't want anybody telling them what to do. They want to do with their bodies what they want to do. They don't want any consequences, and they want to be their own gods. And I was like, okay. So anyway, and of course, if God is the starting point, then of course you have a objective or transcendent source for why humans have moral values, moral duties, why all people have equality, dignity, and rights. You have a standard for why we work for the world to get better. Of course, we have a standard for what true happiness is. So it's a big contrast between the individual and the other way. Now, postmodernism, as I mentioned earlier, falls into this category. A lot of individual subjectivism. Okay, a lot of that's going on. And then finally, if you talk to a Jewish secular person, just like anybody, if their truth language is really wrapped up in identity, I mean, identity is really crucial to them, which it is in these days because people have a crisis of identity. You can find out what your identity is by simply asking them, what are your loves? What is it you want to imitate? What are your loyalties to? What causes you to commit your time? Where are you putting all your time and resources and energy into? What is it? What are you aiming towards? What consumes your thoughts, your time, your attitudes, your actions? You're going to find your identity in that thing. It could be your career. It could be a relationship. It could be stuff. It could be a political party. It could be a sport. It could be your gender. It could be your sexuality. It could be anything. But, that's definitely a good talking point as well. Okay. So, Jewish people that are atheists or secular, I would say in many cases, they're just like anybody else. They haven't really, sometimes you just have to walk them through to why they're atheistic or why they're secular. Have they considered even looking at a personal God? Do they care? Once again, you have to ask them questions. What do they really care? You can ask them, why, if you're culturally Jewish, doesn't a personal God have a role to play in your life? If so, why not? Just find out what the issues are behind their view that a personal God is not needed. And if so, you might run into some atheist objections and things like that. Just depends. But I've shown you some of the different views they have, or some of maybe the truth language that they have. But I don't see this going away. I see this progressively increasing over the years to come. I see more Jewish secularism increasing. Now, I do see some cases, some Jewish people returning to orthodoxy in some places, some pockets there. But as long as the country goes in the direction it's going in other places in Israel as well, we'll always have a good amount of Jewish secularists. And as I said, you don't have to be, if you're ethnically Jewish, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have belief in a personal God. That's just the way the community is set up. So now the Orthodox rabbis don't agree with that, right? They think that you do need to believe in God. But as I said, if you're coming from a Reform background or Reform rabbis talking to you or something else, then obviously it's going to be a case where you're going to have a lot more people in that demographic being just secular, okay, or humanistic, as we say. They're just humanist. It's humanistic Judaism, where humans are more at the center of everything. No belief in a personal God necessarily. Okay. So, as Paul says in Romans 11, remember, there's a partial hardening over Israel for now. So that's something you cannot control because God has done that for right now. There is a hardening. And then one day, as Paul says in Romans, there'll be a shift where all Israel will be saved in the future. So a big group of Jewish people will be saved. But for now, the nations are hearing the gospel. And God has a remnant of Jewish people who believe, not a large amount, but that hardness is there, as we read about in Romans. That's the mystery that Paul talks about. And he's kind of like, Paul doesn't even get it as well. He's wrestling with it, right? If you read Romans 9-11, he's wrestling with it. All right, so that's about all I have, folks.